It was the summer of 1974 in Las Vegas, inside the glittering showroom of the International Hotel. Every seat was filled. 15,000 people had gathered that night, dressed in their finest clothes, their hearts beating with anticipation. The orchestra had just finished a rousing version of C.C. Rider, and now the room had softened into the gentle, intimate opening of Love Me Tender. For many in the audience, it was the moment they had waited for. Elvis Presley, the king of rock. And roll, slowing down to sing the ballad that had defined love for a generation. The spotlight bathed him in a golden glow. His white jumpsuit sparkled under the stage lights, and his voice floated like velvet through the hushed room. Couples in the audience squeezed each other's hands. Women wiped tears from their eyes. Even the waiters, balancing trays at the back, had stopped to listen, and then it happened. From the 10th row, a movement caught Elvis's eye. A woman dressed entirely in black slowly rose to her feet. Her hands shook as she held something small and folded. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak. "Mr. Presley, please, would you read this?" Her voice cracked, echoing through the quiet. The band faltered. The guitarist glanced nervously at the drummer, who let his sticks hover above the snare. The background singers froze, exchanging confused looks. Elvis stopped mid-verse. The lyric died on his lips. The silence in the showroom grew so heavy that the audience could hear the faint hum of the amplifiers. The woman's arms stretched forward, clutching a letter. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. Security moved instantly, pushing through the aisle. This was Las Vegas, after all. Interruptions happened. But before they could reach her, Elvis lifted his hand. "Let her through," he said softly into the microphone. The words stunned everyone. The guards hesitated. The audience gasped. The woman, now trembling, began to walk toward the stage. Each step felt like an eternity. The letter shook in her hand as if it carried the weight of her entire life. Elvis waited. His eyes, normally sparkling with playful mischief, now held a seriousness that silenced even the loudest whisper. She reached the edge of the stage. A guard tried once more to intervene, but Elvis crouched down, extending his hand. The audience of 15,000 people leaned forward as one, holding their breath. The woman placed the folded paper in Elvis's palm. Her hand lingered for just a second, as though passing a sacred burden. When Elvis looked into her eyes, he saw something he couldn't ignore: raw grief. This was not a fan demanding attention. This was not someone begging for an autograph. This was pain. The spotlight widened, capturing both of them, the king of rock and roll and a trembling widow in black. Elvis turned slowly back toward the microphone, the letter now in his hands. He glanced once more at the woman, who was clutching her chest, her lips moving in silent prayer. The audience was restless, whispering, shifting in their seats. What was in that letter? Why had Elvis stopped? Why did this matter? Elvis took a breath, his voice low but clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes something more important than a song comes along." And with that, he carefully unfolded the paper. The crackle of the letter was audible even through the speakers. The crowd went silent. Every heartbeat synced, waiting. For the first time in years, Elvis Presley stood on stage, not as an untouchable star, but as a man holding someone else's story. And then he began to read. "Tell her I fell in love with the girl who danced in the rain outside the county fair when we were 16. Hair soaked, shoes ruined, but smile brighter than the Ferris wheel lights. Tell her I still see that girl, even when the mirror gave just gray hair and lines around the eyes. Tell her I never stopped seeing her." Elvis lowered the paper for a breath, his chest rising like he was the one carrying the weight of decades. The widow's shoulders shook. Someone beside her reached to comfort, but she held her hand up, no interruptions. This was her moment. Elvis read on, his voice more fragile now. "Tell her I noticed the little things, the way she folded the laundry, like it was sacred, the way she cut the crusts off the kids' sandwiches, the way she carried joy like it was a lantern, even on the days I gave her nothing but darkness. Tell her I was watching, always watching." A sniffle, then another, scattered across the audience like raindrops. By now, the Hilton showroom of 15,000 had become a chapel. And tell her this, Mr. Presley. When she hears you sing Love Me Tender, I want her to close her eyes and know that's me. That's me humming along from the other side of the veil. Because love doesn't leave, it just changes address." Elvis stopped. He pressed the paper against his chest as though shielding it from the light, or maybe shielding himself from what it demanded. The crowd sat in silence so deep, it had texture, like wool pulled tight against the skin. Then in a voice low enough to almost vanish, Elvis finished the page. "Thank you for being the voice of our love. And thank you for carrying the words, I cannot. Samuel Carter." Elvis stood frozen, the letter trembling slightly in his hands as the arena went completely silent. The band, sensing something extraordinary, lowered their instruments. Even the rustle of the crowd vanished. It was as though 15,000 souls were collectively holding their breath, waiting for what the king would say next. He cleared his throat, but his voice cracked. The audience had seen Elvis in every mood, playful, flirtatious, commanding, but never like this. His eyes scanned the words again, and the tears he had been trying to hold back spilled freely. Elvis Presley, the most charismatic performer in the world, was now a man breaking on stage. "This," he whispered into the microphone, holding up the letter for the audience to see, "this is a letter from a woman who lost her husband. He was a soldier, a fan. And his last words to her were about me, about this music, about being here with all of you." His voice cracked again. The arena gasped. People in the front rows covered their mouths. The woman in the second row lowered her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks. Elvis looked directly at her, and for a moment it was no longer Elvis Presley, the legend, speaking. It was Elvis Presley, the man. "I've sung thousands of songs in my life," he continued, "but I've never sung for something like this. Tonight, I want you all to know. This stage, this music, it isn't about me. It's about love. It's about holding on when the world tries to take everything away from you." Then, with his hands still shaking, Elvis set the letter gently on the piano. He sat down, motioned for the band to remain quiet, and began to play the opening chords of Love Me Tender. His voice was raw, stripped of performance polish, trembling but more powerful than ever. The crowd of 15,000 erupted, not in cheers but in sobs. Grown men who had come for entertainment found themselves wiping their eyes. Women clutched the hands of their husbands, remembering their own stories of love and loss. And as the spotlight framed Elvis and the widow in the same soft glow, the entire arena became a sanctuary of shared grief and healing. Elvis sang as though every note was carrying her husband's words back to life. And when he reached the line, "For my darling, I love you," his voice cracked once more, and he covered his face with his hand. The audience roared, not with applause, but with empathy. They weren't just watching a concert, they were living inside a moment of history. When the final note of Love Me Tender faded into the rafters, the arena did not erupt in cheers the way concerts usually ended. For a heartbeat, there was only silence, thick, reverent, holy silence. 15,000 people from the back row to the front sat motionless, unable to break the spell. Then, slowly, like a wave building in the ocean, people began to rise. One section stood, then another. Within seconds, the entire arena was on its feet, applauding, not with the wild frenzy of a rock show, but with the steady, thunderous rhythm of gratitude and awe. It sounded less like applause and more like a heartbeat echoing through the building. The widow pressed the letter against her chest, eyes closed, tears streaming freely. Strangers beside her wrapped their arms around her shoulders. For a brief moment, she was no longer alone in her grief. She was carried by 15,000 hearts beating as one. Elvis stood by the piano, head bowed, hands trembling. When he finally looked up, his eyes were swollen with tears, his cheeks glistening in the spotlight. He stepped back to the microphone, his voice hoarse but resolute. "Folks, I don't have the right words tonight. That letter reminded all of us, that music is more than sound. It's memory, it's love. It's the echo of every soul we've ever lost and every hand we've ever held." The audience erupted again, but Elvis raised his hand gently, asking for quiet. "I'm just a singer," he continued. "But if tonight meant something to you, if it reminded you to hold your loved ones tighter, to say what you need to say before it's too late, then that's bigger than any song I could ever sing. Don't wait. Don't wait to love. Don't wait to forgive. Don't wait to say thank you. Tomorrow ain't promised to any of us." The crowd roared, many shouting back, "Amen!" Others simply wept into their hands. Elvis then did something no one expected. He stepped down from the stage and walked into the audience, straight toward the widow. The spotlight followed him as though the heavens themselves were watching. When he reached her, he took her hand in his, lifted it gently to his lips, and whispered words only she could hear. The woman nodded, clutching his hand with both of hers. The audience, watching this sacred exchange, exploded into the longest-standing ovation of Elvis's career. People would later say it lasted nearly 5 minutes. For those 5 minutes, the king of rock and roll wasn't just a performer. He was a vessel for love, grief, and healing. The night of the widow's letter did not end when the lights dimmed and the crowd went home. For years, decades even, people who had been there carried the memory like a sacred relic. They spoke of it in hushed tones, as if describing a miracle they were blessed to witness. Bootleg recordings of the show began to circulate. You could hear Elvis's voice cracking, the muffled sobs of the crowd, and that long, thunderous ovation. Collectors would later call it one of the most treasured tapes in Elvis history, not because of the music, but because of the humanity it captured. Journalists wrote about it the next morning. Elvis Presley stopped being a star last night and became something more, a healer. Newspapers described how a simple letter had transformed a concert into a communal ritual of grief and love. Fans flooded radio stations with calls, describing how the moment had changed them, how they went home and hugged their children tighter, called their parents, or forgave someone they hadn't spoken to in years. The widow herself gave only a few interviews. In each, she clutched the letter, her voice trembling as she recalled the night Elvis held her hand. "He didn't just sing to me," she said. "He sang to my husband, to every soldier, to every soul who was ever missed." Elvis, in private conversations with his closest friends, admitted that he was never the same after that night. "I realized," he told Joe Esposito, "that I have a responsibility. People come to these shows for music, sure, but sometimes they come carrying pain. If I can carry even a piece of that burden for them, then that's worth more than gold records or sold-out arenas." From that night forward, Elvis began including moments of silence in his concerts, dedicated to lost loved ones. He would occasionally tell the story of the widow's letter, though never revealing her name, calling it a gift that reminded me what music is for. Years later, after Elvis was gone, fans would gather at Graceland on the anniversary of that concert. They didn't just bring flowers, they brought letters to husbands, wives, children, parents who had passed on. They tucked them into the gates as though Elvis himself might carry them heavenward in song. Historians would later point to that concert as one of the clearest examples of Elvis Presley's deeper legacy. Not just the king of rock and roll, but a man whose humanity shone brightest when the spotlight revealed his tears. One fan who had been in the audience that night said it best in a television interview years later, "We didn't just watch Elvis sing, we watched him feel, and in that moment, he gave us permission to feel too." And so the story of the widow's letter lived on, not just in recordings, not just in fan recollections, but in the way it reminded millions of people across generations that music, at its best, is love set to melody.